Welcome, good morning, good afternoon, depending on your time zone. Thank you for joining us for another SolSmart webinar. Today's topic is what local governments need to know, coordinating efforts on solar PV and electric vehicles. My name is Toya Barije. I work on the SolSmart program at the Solar Foundation. And for those who are not familiar with the SolSmart program, our first presenter, Philip Krychek, will be able to provide a brief overview of the program. So we'll kick things off by a few introductions. First speaker will be Philip Krychek. He is a senior associate at the Cadmus Group and has supported the SolSmart program from its beginning. He advises public agencies and utilities on strategic sustainability planning with a focus on policies and programs for both EVs and solar. Prior to joining Cadmus, he obtained a dual master's in urban planning and transportation from MIT and spent 10 years working on operational sustainability programs. Our second speaker is Brian Ross, and he is a senior program manager at the Great Plains Institute. He joined the Institute in 2015 after 20 years as a consultant working on sustainability development in local decision-making and implementation. He leads the Institute's work on solar energy market transformation and manages technical and policy programs to help local, regional, and state governments and institutions to meet their climate and renewable energy goals. He manages the Minnesota's Solar Energy Innovation Network project, the Solar+EV Market Transformation Plan, and is working with NREL and Minnesota stakeholders to document value propositions and market pathways for combined solar plus EV applications. Brian is a member of the SolSmart Criteria Advisory Committee, and he has served as a SolSmart advisor across multiple states. So you will be joined by two great speakers who have a great experience in the subject matter. And before we begin the presentation, I would like to highlight that this webinar is being recorded. All attendees are muted and will be muted throughout the webinar. And after our speakers have completed their presentations, you'll have the opportunity to participate in a brief Q&A. Please submit your questions to the organizer through the question feature, through GoToWebinar, or you can email me at tbarigye@solarfound.org. So this webinar is brought to you by SolSmart, and our first speaker is Philip Krychek, who is going to give us a brief overview of the SolSmart program.
Okay, Toya, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, and I will be transferring the screen controls over to you.
Okay. And as we get set up, just a disclaimer, we're having some technical difficulties with the display of the PowerPoint. So we wanted to just double check before we get started that people can see everything, and it may be a little bit glitchy as we go from slide to slide. But Toya, is the screen loaded and you can see the whole slide with,
yes,
I guess,
it is.
The PowerPoint background?
Yes, it is.
All right. Well, we're really glad to have you all here today to participate in the 7th installation of our 2019 SolSmart webinar series. Before we get started, we'd like to give a quick overview of SolSmart since many of you are new to the program. SolSmart is U.S. Department of Energy funded technical assistance and recognition program for communities that have taken steps to reduce solar soft costs and barriers and promote growth of strong solar markets. Led by the Solar Foundation and in partnerships with solar experts from NREL, the Cadmus Group, TSF, and others, the program provides no-cost technical assistance to communities pursuing SolSmart designation. Technical assistance is available for pretty much all the levers of control and influence that municipalities have available to promote solar. However, it must be related to solar. So it could be I just got a pop-up message. Sorry, I need to dismiss this. We've reached our attendee cap. The technical assistance must be related to solar. We can't provide technical assistance exclusively on EV projects unless it relates to the integration with solar. I keep getting attendee cap notifications that are blocking my screen. Okay, so again, this is a resource available to municipalities and jurisdictions across the country through October 2020, so please take advantage of it. With that, let's go ahead and jump right into the topic for today. So the goals today are to provide municipalities with a high-level understanding of the benefits of integrating solar and electric vehicle charging and the ways in which they can take action. After we discuss the types of actions being taken around the country, we'll present a case study from the Solar Energy Innovation Network in Minnesota. Finally, we'll give you a taste of some further considerations that we plan to dive into in future webinars. So to kick it off, EV and PV integration can offer numerous benefits. On the grid side, this can relate to reducing the amount of load at peak times via installing solar at locations that also have substantial demand, which can reduce the need for investments in the local distribution system. EVs are also a great demand response resource, particularly in situations where customers are parked with a long dwell time and have no expectations for a quick charge. And in the long term, many states are going to be installing a whole lot of storage to meet ambitious renewable energy goals. California already has over 1.5 gigawatts and likely will need a whole lot more than that. And the more that the storage can be served by batteries that serve other purposes like transportation, the better. In terms of cost and time savings to entities that are pursuing projects, all the site analysis and engineering can be conducted at once rather than separately. Some municipalities may offer streamlined permitting. EV load can provide more scale to make solar more cost effective. And cheaper power provided by solar can also provide inexpensive ways to refuel vehicles. And then, so in terms of complementary infrastructure, the make-ready investments that utilities must make should be considered at the same time. And so it's a good idea to think about EV and PV together. And then finally, in terms of emissions reductions, EVs are only as clean as the energy that's used to fuel them. So it's important to make note of that when you plan for your deployment. So on the next slide, before we get started, I wanted to talk through a little bit about what we mean by the integration of EV and PV, because it could be a bunch of different topics when we talk with local governments. It can be as simple as coordination of policy and programs that advance both technologies simultaneously, and we'll describe several examples of these. But when looking at specific projects where solar and EV are both installed, there can be a range of economic and physical linkages. One of the simplest ways that linkage can occur is the geographic co-location of the resources, for instance, on the same property. However, without managed charging, this may have limited societal benefits and benefits to the host because EVs may be charging when no solar is being produced. A slightly more advanced link is that EV charging can be controlled based on signals of when the grid is cleanest, as is happening in a handful of demonstration projects around the country. This does not actually require solar to be installed by the host, but the host maximizes the societal benefit through their charging patterns. And then finally, an example of an economic link between solar and EV charging would be the act of buying green power for charging. In the next few slides, we'll show a few examples of the physical links between EVs and solar. So the simplest one of these is just looking at having them both behind the meter. An example of this in practice would be a solar parking canopy that powers EV chargers. The benefits can include lower metering costs, the invisibility of properly timed EV load, the utility, and a simple billing structure. Configurations can also include a direct DC to DC connection between the EV and PV, such as is provided by vendors like SolarEdge. This can increase system efficiency, but without a battery or grid connection, the combination is limited to instances of concurrent PV production and EV charging, and charge management software is critical to maximize the benefit. The next example we have is using charge management. As I said above, it's a critical link that'll enable the benefits of solar and EV to be maximized together. Many vendors do provide such solutions, and we can discuss the ways in which it can be done later on. The next physical link is to have an integrated system that has EV, PV, charge management, and solar and storage as well. A good example would be the Tesla Powerwall, or in the case of EV charging via solar carports, it may not even be connected to the grid. You can look at something like Envision Solar's EV Arc. And this behind the meter arrangement, the storage allows the customers to capture the energy from on-site generation and utilize it at a more valuable or better time. And installing on-site storage can also enhance a customer's resilience in the face of disruptions to the electricity grid. However, a major drawback for many customers is the cost of battery storage. While the cost continues to fall rapidly, for most applications, it's still a major barrier. I'm still getting pop-up messages. So can I just confirm with you that you're able to see the slides appropriately? Take a little break here.
Hi, yes, I apologize. We have reached a cap of participants. I am trying to see how I can increase that cap. You should stop getting those pop-ups.
Okay, great. And you can see, but you can see the slides well?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. Just because we're not doing this in the standard PowerPoint slide deck, I wanted to make sure. Okay, so the final physical example is the example of EV and PV metered separately. And this may be due to a utility requirement, or due to the fact that these may be at different locations. And benefit of this arrangement is the rates can be tailored to the specific end use that they serve, so that allows customers to navigate their costs more easily. And it can also allow the site host to allocate costs incurred by the charging activity differently from how they allocate other operational costs and the benefits of the solar production. So in the instance of, say, an entity that's charging for charging, it could be a useful arrangement. A downside to this type of configuration, of course, is the fact that installing an additional meter, an electric panel, or any other surface upgrades can add extra cost to the project's bottom line. So the final linkage we wanted to talk about was more of an economic linkage, where you're looking at either independently metered or remotely sited solar. And as I said above, a physical connection is not necessary to capture the simultaneous benefit of these technologies. This can be set up through arrangements like virtual net metering, community solar farms, or power subscription services, where the solar production offsets the cost of EV-related electricity consumption through a financial arrangement. And it's important to note, though, that state net metering and rate policies are very diverse, and locations with EV-only metering, as opposed to full facility metering, utility rates may provide or impose limits to the ability to eliminate demand charges, which is one of the real values of the synchronization of these technologies. So having covered the landscape of what we could mean by this, I wanted to jump in to talk about the different categorization of activities available to local governments. We see these falling into 4 buckets: education and outreach, public investment in solar-powered charging as lead by example activities, and of course, incentives and regulations over which the municipality has control, such as building codes, parking codes, permitting, and planning and zoning ordinances. So for the rest of this overview, we're going to talk through a couple examples of each of those. So starting with outreach and education, we're going to provide an overview of the types of outreach and education, and then go into some examples. So in terms of the activities and the value of them, education and outreach can enable property owners and constituents in your communities to better understand opportunities for EV and PV integration. One benefit of this type of action is that many of the same community members who may be early adopters for solar may also be early EV adopters. So a coordinated approach can save municipalities' staff time on outreach and leverage existing outreach efforts more thoroughly. Another benefit is that community members may see a better payback if they do their projects concurrently, and they may size their solar systems appropriately for their load, inclusive of the EVs that they have. By combining EV and PV information into a single clearinghouse, the first option we list here, governments can provide a one-stop shop for information that will help community members navigate the process. This can include things like locating available grants and incentive funds and local installers. And then once installations are done, it could include how to get onto the best rate class with the local utility. Another opportunity is to tailor information to hosts that would be well suited for this combination. For instance, workplaces where charging would happen during peak, solar production hours, or school districts. This sort of education could also happen within the installer community. For instance, by providing informational packets upon submission of a permit application. And then a final opportunity is really thinking about group buys and cooperative purchasing opportunities, which are a way of really leveraging volume to reduce the cost to going solar and going EV together. So the first example of outreach and education is Solar+EV Mass Plus, which is a program that provides a combined information clearinghouse that shows the complementarity of EV and PV technologies in terms of fuel cost savings. It also identifies incentives available to fund their integration. As you can see in this image, it shows what the cost to fuel your EV would be if you didn't go with a solar system as well as the cost if you did go with a solar system. This program is also a great impact of a group buy, which we'll discuss shortly. So the next type of education or example is savings calculators. It's a great example of the type of information that can be provided. NYSERDA and PG&E have some really great examples. Solar Smart cities may not need to reinvent the wheel here, but rather promote and amplify the impact of calculators that already exist and are relevant in your region. You can also rely on technical assistance to help create these tools through Solar Smart, for instance. Then the final example of outreach and education is group buys, which, as I mentioned, leverage participant numbers to increase negotiating power and secure group purchase discount. The programs are most successful when they provide limited time offers to motivate participants. They focus on a limited number of dealers, vendors, and products, and involve substantial stakeholder engagement upfront. On the EV side of a group buy, our Fleets for the Future project, which wrapped up last year, found that a discount of $10,000 was enough to catapult local markets to become one of the fastest growing EV markets in the country. However, getting the dealers to appropriately stock up their inventory in advance of a group buy was a challenge. And for the first wave of the program in the city that we deployed it in, Kansas City, sales were hampered by vehicle availability. Dealers may now be more eager partners as there's so much data available from around the country on how successful these programs have been. As you can see in the bar charts that came from a Swift meta study of a bunch of EV group buys, the before and after sales in several cities around the country. And then on the PV side, PV group buys are frequently called Solar+EV campaigns, and they've been implemented successfully by hundreds of municipalities in the US. A unique element to these campaigns is the degree of control the municipality has during the RFP process. They can design tiered pricing that will motivate participants to recruit additional participants because the price gets better the more people sign on. They can also favor local vendors to encourage the development of a local installer market. And they can provide special benefits for nonprofits or community serving institutions as part of their program design. And as I mentioned, there are many examples of where EV and PV group buys have been combined. The Solar+EV Massachusetts Plus is a good example, as well as Bay Area Sun Shares and Appalachian, Ohio region as well did a program. So wrapping up the education and outreach section of this presentation, I just wanted to mention that in both solar and EV adoption, regional coordination has consistently provided strong value. Regional councils and councils of government and even states can convene groups of municipalities and other stakeholders such that resources and campaigns are developed according to the comparative strength of each entity, and particularly on outreach and education, establishing key messengers that can serve as trusted one-stop shops has been particularly beneficial. An example of a cohort that's pursued co-learning and collaboration to great success is the Twin Cities region through the Cities Charging Ahead initiative, which Brian will describe later. So moving on to examples of lead by example investments. I'm going to start with an overview again. Municipalities do serve as workplaces, as landlords, and as consumers. So cities can save money and provide amenities for their constituents by integrating solar and EVs, and they'll get the most benefit from synchronizing the investments. Some examples include workplace and public charging at government buildings, integrating EVs into light-duty fleets in the government sector, and electrifying school buses and transit buses with using PV as a central part of the strategy. Another way that lead by example programs have succeeded is the development of resilience and microgrid pilot projects. So the first example is from Pittsburgh, California, and it relates to school buses. So if sufficient grant funding and other funds are available to mitigate the upfront purchase costs, school buses present a great opportunity for solar and EV due to their typical duty cycles. Even without the benefit of co-optimizing solar with electric school buses, the California Energy Commission estimates that these buses can save nearly $120,000 per bus over their lifetime in fuel and maintenance costs relative to diesel. Pittsburgh Unified School District has jumped on the opportunity to marry these benefits with a PV installation. They updated their aging fleet by purchasing 2 electric buses and are in the process of purchasing 7 more in 2019. Concurrently, they have been launching their bioswale solar and wind generation project, which has outfit an acre of land with solar panels and vertical axis wind turbines with a total production of over 200 kW. These are actually red solar panels, which is really neat because they allow the appropriate wavelengths through to allow vegetation to grow optimally below. And this is a type of installation that's been piloted in a few greenhouses, but it's not yet mass market. So it's kind of an exciting project from that element as well. But the real interesting part here is the work they're doing with the utility PG&E to optimize the state of charge on the buses based on signals from the grid and based on the production of these renewables. In some cases, this may actually mean not charging the buses when they arrive at the school after the morning run, so that they have availability to take excess supply when PG&E is willing to pay them to do so. So another example is the Berkeley Energy Assurance Transformation Project, which explored how to design a clean energy microgrid to serve key municipal buildings and improve community resilience. While they ultimately did not implement a microgrid due to costs and regulatory barriers, they did install a sizable PV system and at least 20 chargers and design the facility to be microgrid ready. One of the policy considerations associated with the combination of the EV and solar there was, in this case, was whether to charge EV owners for both charging and for parking. In theory, the PV array is offsetting the cost of charging and reducing electric costs for the full facility. However, the PV system comes with real capital costs and upfront costs, so not charging for charging could be considered a subsidy, which may disproportionately help wealthy homeowners and EV owners. And so it was a policy decision to charge for both in this case. So moving on to incentives, I'm going to talk about ways that you can get the private sector to be acting in your interests, and wanted to point out that these incentives do not need to be financial in nature or involve direct outlays of money. Some of those that are no cost to the municipality include bonus density, reducing parking minimums for buildings that have PV and EV together, expedited permitting for PV and EV systems, and financing via the county PACE program or something similar. There are, of course, incentives that municipalities are implementing that do cost money. Those can include permitting fee waivers or rebates for purchasers of both systems. And that's often the case if you have a municipal utility that's willing to do that. So as an example, well, basically, many SolSmart designees provide great examples of jurisdictions that have deployed incentives for solar. Superior, Colorado is a great one where they've waived permit application fees for PV systems, they've provided expedited permitting, and they've made sample permit applications available online. The exact same sorts of actions are being taken by many other municipalities to encourage EV adoption. So the integration of these two, a city could decide whether to waive or reduce fees for both types of projects, or potentially only waive fees if the project involved an effort to implement smart charging that was optimized with the solar. And this decision would, of course, be dependent on policy priorities and market conditions. Another way that incentives have been combined is in places where they have bonus density incentives, like allowing greater floor area ratios for developers. Arlington, Virginia offers a program using LEED as a measurement tool. Both EV and PV actions can lead to LEED points, which result in a bonus of up to half an FAR for buildings that reach LEED Platinum. Solar or renewable energy generation in this case is a priority credit defined by Arlington, and that can result in additional FAR reward. And the success of this project is that it's spurred 47 building projects to take action and receive bonuses. There are similar point systems in many communities across the country, ranging from large cities to small towns. We're not aware of any that explicitly encourage synchronization of solar production and vehicle electricity consumption, although this is a policy that could have substantial benefits to the grid and the environment. So with that, we'll move on to regulations within the municipality's control, and I'm going to turn it over to Brian at this point. Brian, are you able to be heard?
I'm on. Can you hear me?
You sound good.
Okay. Well, thanks, Philip, and I'm going to talk a little about the component of local government, the local government toolbox, where we have moved from kind of leaving the decision in the hands of the private sector actor, and we're actually requiring then the private sector actor to take certain kinds of actions that we see consistent with the community benefit. That's kind of the regulatory approach and the police powers that we use at the local government level. And it encompasses a lot of our zoning regulations as well as other kinds of ordinances that the city will put in place. The local governments do have different kinds of opportunities to use their regulatory powers to affect solar and EV development within the private sector. We have generally two broad categories of regulation that we would talk about in terms of building codes and zoning codes or development regulations, which many times get bundled together as if they're one thing, because they're typically handled by the applicant at the same point in the counter. The person comes to the counter and they have to justify both a zoning requirement and a building code application and requirement, but in fact they are very different things. And we have different states where there's different enabling legislation that allows some cities to use some of these tools, while other cities cannot use them. We do also have the permitting processes kind of tool that Philip has already mentioned in terms of kind of the way that we have combined permit applications on the building code side of the equation. But the code tools up above, municipal tools to direct the private sector, include building stretch codes or reach codes that are designed by the municipality. We can have parking standards that are EV ready. We can use various kinds of flexible zoning for both solar ready and EV ready construction, and then kind of making sure that we remove barriers to both solar and to EV installations by creating by right language within our zoning code, so that they don't require additional zoning permits such as conditional use permits, rezonings, or variances. Okay, go to the next slide. One example of a of what a community in Minnesota has done, the St. Paul Sustainable Building Policy, which is they're now starting to call an ordinance. They're in the process of changing it from a more of a policy to an actual ordinance. It is recognizing that the city of St. Paul, like all cities in Minnesota, do not have the ability to use the building code to meet their greenhouse gas reduction goals and their climate goals. So it is in Minnesota, there's a max-min code. They can neither exceed nor go below the code, the statewide code. And so instead, they've put together a program where whenever the city is a financial participant in the development process, and they reach a threshold of value of $200,000 or more, which is a fairly high percentage of the large-scale commercial projects that are going on in the city, then the local government is requiring, or when the ordinance is fully in place, which will be very soon, is requiring both that these developments install EV charging infrastructure and that they have an on-site generation component to the development. And this is, while they have not deliberately linked these two, in other words, that they have to be synchronized, it is kind of setting in place the infrastructure and the programmatic guidelines to have a Solar+EV installation and kind of paving the way and removing barriers to seeing this kind of thing happen more routinely in new development when the city is a financial participant in the development. Okay, go to the next slide. Another example that we've seen recently here in Minnesota is the St. Louis Park. City of St. Louis Park has instituted probably one of the more aggressive mandates for electric vehicle charging in the private sector within its development code, both all within its parking standards as well as within some of the other components of its development code. They are requiring new developments to install either actual EV charging or EV-ready facilities, or sometimes both, depending on the kind of characteristics of the use that they're targeting. They are looking at a variety of different kinds of uses where these regulations and requirements are in place, and they did a great deal of investigation about how this will play out on the different kinds of land uses and the different kinds of that they have already identified within their zoning code and the different kinds of zoning districts that they have, and trying to get to the full market of EV infrastructure that needs to be in place. City of St. Louis Park has a very aggressive climate action plan in place where they have a carbon neutral by 2040 standard, and they have realized that in order to achieve that standard, they have to very aggressively get to market transformation efforts on the transportation side of that equation, as well as recognizing the local power generation needs that they will have to meet primarily through solar energy on site, as well as some purchase of green power from outside the city. Okay, go to the next slide. We do see a similar or a different kind of application here where we're looking at the other type of private sector influence that cities have in creation of a combined EV-PV permit, so that the person who wants to install, for instance, a solar carport with EV charging in it can file a single permit online, in email submission, rather than come in and ask for those two different technologies separately and have different inspection processes and the like. This is it of course is happening in California, where we see a lot more aggressive market development of both EV and PV, and so there's a more mature market that is responsive in the development world to those kinds of needs. But it is something that we're likely to see increasingly as the EV market heats up everywhere else in the country, as well as, of course, the solar PV market continuing to grow. So this is another tool that local governments can use. Okay, go to the next slide. And now I want to talk a little bit about the specific case study, now that we're through the kind of set of tools that local governments can use to address market transformation efforts on solar plus EV. We developed a project through the National Solar Energy Innovation Network program, which is run by the National Renewable Energy Lab, over the last 18 months. They had 9 teams around the nation that are all proposing to do different kinds of innovative solar energy initiatives, some of which are local, looking at just a single city or a few cities. Other ones were statewide, and there was even some multi-state projects that were looking at some very innovative applications for solar energy. In Minnesota, what we did was to, for our project, and go to the next slide, sorry, is to look specifically at EV plus PV or solar plus EV market transformation efforts to see whether or not in a place like Minnesota, where we have a burgeoning market in both distributed generation and in our EV markets, that we could ramp up those two markets simultaneously in order to achieve some synergies and to capture additional benefits that the two technologies by themselves would not be able to capture. We specifically were looking at, in terms of kind of synchronizing distributed solar with electric vehicle charging, how that would maximize the distributed solar value to the customer, the person who actually owns the solar array, as well as the EV charging, and minimizing costs of EV charging simultaneously. We were also considering how such technologies, looking beyond the customer, might actually improve utilization of the local utility grid. One of the dilemmas that we have seen in a lot of the research that has gone on about EV markets is, as EV markets ramp up and as we get increasing numbers of people charging during the day, even kind of at workplace or public charging, it can pose limitations on the electric grid. If you have simultaneous charging of multiple EVs, it can create capacity problems that both affect the quality of service on the grid, as well as accelerates the degradation of equipment, and so it requires more rapid replacement and additions of capacity. And by combining solar with EV and synchronizing it so that they happen at the same time using various technical approaches that Philip mentioned earlier in synchronization, you can actually offset that both the impact on the grid in terms of the degradation of the equipment, as well as the needs for additional capacity, by solving that with a local generation combined with a local load. That also enables additional renewable energy production to be made on the system and reduces the amount of curtailment that you will see as your solar energy markets ramp up, where you have seen in a number of different communities now across the nation where particularly where there's robust solar markets, where during the midday the wholesale power markets are going into negative territory, where it's actually negative power prices because there's so much electricity on the system, and the solar energy systems have to be curtailed. We do see this as well in the Midwest with our wind energy systems when there's a lot of wind production and there's not enough load to take it. By moving a flexible load like EV charging into those spots, you actually increase the amount of renewable energy on the system. And then, of course, really what a lot of these things are trying to get to are trying to achieve local and state decarbonization goals. As a number of states are moving to 100% clean energy and aggressive decarbonization standards, as well as local governments now that are doing that. And these are tools by which, by combining these two uses, we can actually achieve that and get to our clean energy grid. Okay, go to the next slide. We did do a project here in Minnesota where we tested the technology of doing a synchronization of solar production and EV charging. This can be done either directly in a physical manner where the wires are actually hooked up, or via a communication system, which is what we did here. We have a solar array on the roof. We put 3 EV chargers out in the parking lot, and then we have a communications network that every minute samples both of them, and it will modify the EV charging rate in order to follow the solar production, which you can see here on this graph in one of the early days of our of our experiment that we have going on here at the Great Plains Institute facility. You can see how there's a single EV that plugged in at about 8:30 in the morning, and it did not get a full level 2 charge initially because there wasn't enough solar production to justify it. Then as the solar kind of ramped up on a full sunny day, as you can see that solar curve, the EV production came up until it hit its full level 2 production, which is about 6.6 kW of charge. And then there's a single spike there where a second car plugged in, but at about that same time, the first car was fully charged, and so the EV production continued across the day. But in the afternoon, the clouds rolled in, and so we start seeing some intermittent solar production where a cloud would come in, solar production would dip down for just a little bit and then go back up. And you can see that when that got to the point where it was actually affecting the EV charging, the system did in fact respond as planned. And as solar production went down, the EV charging went down, and as it went back up, the EV charging went back up, and then until it tailed off at the end of the day. And we do have an override built into the current system where it will always charge at least a level 1 rate. But so we can see even when the solar production tailed out, this is on a January day, so the sun sets pretty early in Minnesota. And you can see that the final car was charging when there wasn't any solar production. But what this does is that it avoids the demand charge that would normally be associated with the EV charger. So there's a direct benefit under a behind-the-meter scenario to the customer of doing this, added value that they would not get from their solar array were they not also hooked up to the EV charger. Okay, go to the next slide. In our study, we looked at what are the different use cases for solar plus EV applications. One of the big findings that we had in looking at where this would actually work was that the sun shines during the day, and it doesn't shine at night. So if we're charging at night, it's a little bit more difficult to have a solar plus EV use case. So we did focus primarily on use cases where we were able to capture that. We did look briefly at residential charging as an option. There is a small overlap between solar production and EV charging patterns with residential customers, but generally they're a nighttime charger. And actually in the Midwest, we have a lot of wind energy and we have a lot of utilities that are already doing a synchronization for nighttime charging with wind energy. And so we focused instead on some of the other kinds of uses where you do have some overlap of what we would call the daytime charging. All of the forecasts for charging as we look nationally at the build out of the EV network and the EV market, 80% of the charging is probably going to happen at home, 80% or more, and it will tend to be happen in the evenings or at nighttime. But about 15 to 20% will occur during the day, and this will happen in places like workplaces, at public parking lots, park and ride facilities. There will be some destination land uses where people will go and stay for several hours. There's some fleet charging that happens during the day because there's fleet use, and that come in and out from the either private fleet or public fleet. We see some opportunities specific to mixed-use development where you have both a residential and a commercial use together, and there's an opportunity to combine the infrastructure in such a way as that you can utilize both of that and also capture some of the solar benefit on your daytime charging. And then we looked at a couple of opportunities for using community solar gardens and EV charging as a means to market both of those things. What we discovered, if you go to the next slide, is that the priority cases, the ones where there was the least number of barriers in terms of a use case to market application, were places where there was enough EV charging and enough solar opportunity to capture economies of scale, both in the installation and size of the solar array, but also even in the installation in the demand for EV parking in terms of the number of cars in a parking lot. We also identified there had to be metering provisions and rates in place that would allow the opportunity for reducing the metered peak use or the demand charge. This is primarily a commercial use and a commercial rate schedule where they're going to be charged both energy and demand. And the savings from this was maximized from a solar plus EV synchronized approach was realized by reducing the demand charge dramatically or to zero by coupling it with the the PV charging. And finally, we had to have parking patterns at the facility that were long enough to have enough dwell time to allow for optimizing the various distributed energy resources that you might want to look into in this scenario, because we did look beyond just a solar plus EV scenario and did look at use cases and at some of the economic modeling for not only charging and solar production, but of course managed charging, and then storage, battery storage, and also synchronizing with the rest of the building load. And you can see there's a graph up there, a map up there that shows in the 7-county metropolitan area, Minneapolis, St. Paul, the parking lots around the metro area that have 100,000 square feet of parking space or more. So these are places where there's lots of parking, and there is also lots of acreage for potential unshaded solar capture. Obviously you can go a lot smaller than 100,000 square feet and still capture this. The picture down here is for a parking lot that is much smaller than 100,000 square feet, where you can also capture this. But it's kind of the starting analysis that we're going through about opportunity. Okay, go to the next slide. The National Renewable Energy Lab has done some very detailed modeling for us on the value proposition. They've looked at a number of different cases on how you capture value for the customer, looking at a simple EV charging with solar without any synchronization. In other words, just kind of having them in the same place behind the meter. And what we discover in those cases is that there's actually very little benefit. It's a fairly small overlap when you have an unmanaged charging at a workplace and solar production. The charging tends to happen at 9 in the morning, and then by noon, most cars have become fully charged. And so when your solar production is really hitting its peak, your cars are all shutting off because they're fully charged. What you want to be able to do is move that charging to noon, and still be able to fully charge that car later, which is the second scenario there, where you actually are synchronizing those. And we discovered in the modeling effort that NREL has done, which I would show you some graphs, but they're still in draft form. We will be putting these out in the public realm very soon. That you can completely synchronize in most cases EV plus solar applications in such a way as to eliminate the demand charge impacts to the commercial customer. We then looked at EV plus solar plus battery storage, in combining this both with synchronization and without, to see if whether or not it made more sense to use batteries than to synchronize the solar plus EV, which in the short answer is no, it does not. The synchronization is far cheaper to use than the battery, although there is still some benefit to battery storage, and there's still an economic case to be made with battery costs coming down, even if it's just a small amount. But the more that you can capture your benefit through synchronization, the less money you have to spend on battery storage in order to meet your goals. And then finally, we looked at the combination of all those things, EV storage, solar, plus the building load, all behind a single meter and with and without synchronization, where we would actually size the building load or size the solar array to the building load optimization rather than just to the EV production. And so there was a whole case to be made about adding a whole lot more PV capacity in those cases in order to kind of capture not only the EV charging benefit, but also the economic case to be made about serving a larger amount of your building load, provided, of course, you have enough solar capacity on site to do that. Okay, go to the next slide. We did engage a lot of local governments around this, and Philip mentioned earlier our Cities Charging Ahead program, which was actually a parallel project to our Solar Energy Innovation Network project, where we worked with 28 cities across the state in 4 different cohorts of cities on how to become EV ready. We had a very large demand for this. We actually had to cut off the number of cities that were joining the cohorts because we couldn't take any more. And we had regional cohorts that we put together, one for the metro area, but also one in the northeast Minnesota and southeast Minnesota, and then one for the rest of the state, where the cities would come together and they would have a co-learning process about what it means to be EV ready and how you go about doing things like acquiring resources to do fleet studies. Fleet Karma, one of those companies that does that kind of thing, did it for a number of the cities here in this program, as well as how you write development regulations or parking standards that are applicable to your community, whereby you can actually get the private sector to start providing some of the needed infrastructure you're going to need for market transformation efforts on Solar+EV moving ahead. And then, of course, also looking at how do you ensure and maximize the use of clean energy for your charging. As Philip mentioned earlier, that the charging is only as clean as the energy that's going into it. Or the EV usage is only as clean as the energy going into it. In the Midwest, we generally have fairly clean power. At least in the upper Midwest, we do. In other parts of the Midwest and other parts of the country, we still see an awful lot of coal power, and so in terms of the kind of emission profile of your EV is dramatically changed when you have a lot of high emission power plants that are powering the network. You can actually get around that locally. You can avoid that problem by doing a combined Solar+EV project and making sure that you're synchronizing and capturing that solar value in your charging network moving ahead in order to meet local goals. These cities were all interested in trying to meet local greenhouse gas or energy, clean energy goals, and so that was an important thing to them. Okay, and going to the next, as part of the project, we also did an assessment of across the nation of zoning and development regulation that is trying to affect where cities are trying to affect the development of infrastructure in the private sector as development occurs for EVs. And this was not looking specifically at EV and solar, but just at EV infrastructure. We actually did not find any city that was requiring solar as well, although we are going to be writing hopefully a model ordinance to do that, and hope to integrate it into our sustainable city programs and also to maybe push it out via the SolSmart network. But we looked at all these different kinds of ordinances across the nation, and in this we were only looking at the development regulation, not at energy codes. Building codes, I should say, because that is not an option that was available to Minnesota. I do want to mention that is a tool that is important to a lot of places in the nation, and in fact, we've seen this occur. Some very similar things in some cities that occur via the building code are done in other cities via the zoning code. We had kind of 8 categories of best practice here that you need to address. You can go online and get this document. We have published it on the Great Plains website. We wrote a blog about it as well as publishing a document. It's about 28 pages. It has these 8 categories of different kinds of examples from around the country of ways that cities are encouraging or requiring EV infrastructure in new development. Okay, go to the next. And then finally, our pilot project, we did, our case study, we did develop several pilot projects or demonstration projects, or enhanced some that were already underway. We have the Capitol complex in St. Paul was installing about 600 kW of solar energy on the site, and they are on a single metered kind of almost like a microgrid where they have combined everything behind effectively 1 meter. They also have 72 EV chargers on site, but all of these chargers were what we would say are dumb chargers. They were not chargers that you could do managed charging on. And what the case study we're looking at, and we're having some modeling done for, is what is the economic case for converting those 72 EV chargers to a managed charger that would allow for solar synchronization with the on-site solar and capture some of the demand charge benefit that they might not have been otherwise capturing by limiting the impact of those EV chargers as they move ahead. These chargers were somewhat underutilized, but their use is increasing, and we're going to look at where the threshold is for making an economic case on that swap out. We also worked with several cities for some smaller kind of pilot projects in these smaller cities where we're installing a dual head level 2 chargers. Each one of them is going to be linked to solar production in some different manner, either on-site, off-site, or via a renewable energy program. And we're going to look at how that works and plays out, and what the reaction is to people who are using these facilities. And this actually all came about from the VW settlement money that Minnesota had, that all of the other states in the nation also have access to. We have 4 cities that are now collaborating in a mini cohort to look at solar carport development, either for their fleet or at public charging facilities for the general public. And these carports would be anywhere from accommodating just a few sites or a few EV chargers to as many as 50 vehicles in one case, where it's going to be more of a fleet application, but still also to kind of see about the collaboration between those two technologies. And then finally, the Metro, our Metropolitan Transit Agency, is in the process converting its entire fleet over the next 15 years to electric buses. They are looking at building a new facility downtown that will be able to accommodate approximately 200 electric buses. It will have about 6 megawatts worth of charging capacity. It will be built with a solar-ready roof for 2 megawatts worth of solar, and they are already planning to use battery storage for resilience and load management, which they could then tie to the solar, so that they could then be charging using solar-powered energy at night when the buses come back to the bus garage. Okay, and you can move on, and I'm going to hand it back to Philip.
All right. Well, we're about at time. I just wanted to mention that we have a couple follow-up webinars that we're planning to present. You heard us talk about some of the barriers and challenges, as well as best practices over the course of this hour at a 30,000-foot view. We would like to dig in on some of these topics with you, and we'll be sending a follow-up to list these options, and we would love your input about what you'd like to hear next, who you might want to tip off to these additional follow-up webinars, and just wanted to note that the next webinars will be more likely to be a panel format. We're going to recruit a handful of leading practitioners to discuss their experience in very specific programs around utility engagement, municipal utility policies, how to do all this equitably and think about the cross-subsidization and other challenges of reaching harder to reach markets, and looking at transit e-bus deployment examples as well, and financing for those. And then, of course, technology solutions for synchronizing charging and PV production via smart meters. So think about that, what you'd like to hear more about, and we'll love to have you on a future webinar. We're at the top of the hour, and I personally can stick on if anyone has questions. I don't know, Toya, if we get booted off of this forum, but if we don't, I can definitely stick around for a little bit.
Yeah, I think it would be beneficial just to give it maybe 5 more minutes, just to answer a few questions that came in.
Okay. I don't see any questions in my interface. Have you seen any questions?
Yes, there are a couple of questions. The first one is, do vehicle manufacturers, both passenger and bus, support vehicle to grid? And also, is there any impact on warranties? I don't know if this is a question either you or Brian can answer.
Specific to the vehicle to grid application on the warranty?
Yes.
Well, and I'm sure Philip can talk to this pretty extensively. Right now, vehicle to grid applications are not quite ready for prime time. There are a few examples we've seen out there where we've seen operational programs as well as some pilots in a number of different places. However, the standards are just going into place now, or in some places that haven't actually been in place, on how vehicle-to-grid applications would work. And the car manufacturers, my understanding, and Philip can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the vehicle manufacturers have not fully bought off onto the vehicle-to-grid kind of application. So I think that we're really a ways away from seeing a large-scale deployment of vehicle-to-grid, which is one reason why we have been emphasizing the managed charging option, because you can actually get a good chunk of your benefit that you would get from a vehicle-to-grid application by just doing managed charging, especially when you have local generation.
Yeah, just to add on to what Brian said, I would agree that that's generally what I've seen as well. We have seen some example pilots where Nissan Leafs were outfitted with V2G technology and experimented with, and there's been a lot of economic studies about the value that V2G provides in terms of frequency regulation and all the ancillary services that utilities might value. And generally speaking, those have not necessarily shown V2G to be a slam dunk at the current stage, in terms of, like, if you weigh the potential degradation over the long term to the battery of using, and you weigh all the sort of operational difficulties around, like, well, the not necessarily having the reliable range if you wanted to sort of also be using it to provide services. Those have been barriers, and the cost and the benefits that you can get sort of from just the one-way flow where you're just managing your charging will get a majority of those economic benefits that people have found when they studied it.
Great, thank you for that. And we have time for just one more question. Is there any data regarding the success or impact of non-direct financial incentives and no-cost incentives?
I'm sorry, I lost the second half of that question.
Is there any data regarding the success or impact of non-direct financial incentives and no-cost incentives?
That would be something that I would.
Yeah, go ahead, Philip.
I was going to say I'd let Brian weigh in on this, but there's, in many real estate markets where there's maximum heights and urban real estate is a prime commodity, things like bonus density and bonus FAR have a very strong, enticing value. And of course, there are many different things you might want to encourage with bonus density and bonus FAR requirements. And so there's a sort of a trade-off, whether you want to put all your eggs in the basket of promoting solar and EV, or promoting, say, many other policy priorities, such as like the ratio of market rate affordable housing, market rate versus affordable housing, and all those sorts of things are subject to exactions and negotiations when you look at bonus densities. But from a general perspective, I'm not aware of community studies. I haven't really scanned the literature on that, other than that it's a pretty intuitive link that some of those options are likely to be pretty valuable to the developer community.
And I am largely in agreement with that. I have found for incentive programs generally that they are usually a stepping stone to ultimately just making it a requirement for local governments. It makes people more comfortable that the first step is an incentive program to make sure that there's not any barriers, and if there are barriers, then it never becomes a regulation. So it's kind of a test case in a way. But usually what happens is that places where there is in fact value in the marketplace, the incentive is a way to maybe accelerate that a little bit, and it becomes then the norm that the development community uses. And so you transform the actual development community expectations and the development norms you see via an incentive program, which then becomes the norm, and you either just let it go as the norm, or you then incorporate it into the expectation in terms of your regulation. So things like FAR bonuses and other kinds of non-financial incentives are a useful tool, usually in terms of the market transformation effort, but not on the long term for really making transformative change throughout the community. We do see, and I will make the exception to that would be, I think, where you have in a couple cities that we've looked at, and one of those I highlighted with the city of St. Paul, where you're not providing the incentive necessarily for it's not an incentive for EV charging, but rather an incentive, but rather tying the EV charging to the incentive. In other words, people come to the city of St. Paul and say, we want to have some TIF financing, and they say, okay, good. If you're going to do TIF financing, you're also going to do these 4 things that we want you to do. So it's kind of the reverse of the way you might think about an incentive. It's tying the expectation to the incentive rather than the incentive to the expectation. And that seems to be a little bit more effective way to get to things. And that works also for the non-financial end in terms of things like PUDs, where the city will actually define the components upon which they will provide flexibility and the specific benefits that they expect to receive for those things, putting in stuff like EV charging and solar, or solar combined with EV charging, and making that a component of your PUD. The developer is not really interested in doing, in those cases, the solar and the EV, but they are interested in getting some other thing like a mix of uses that they wouldn't have gotten, or an increased density that they wouldn't have gotten for that particular site, that makes it a lot more valuable.
Great. Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Philip, for your presentations. With the audience, I will be sharing the recording of this webinar as well as some of the slides. I'll send you a follow-up link with that information shortly. If you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to me. My name is Toya with the Solar Foundation, and my email is tbarigie@solarfound.org. Thank you again for all your comments and questions, as well as the great presentations from our speakers today. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.